to this meeting that we're going to be having today, and we're going to have some very good presentations. Prior to us getting started, honorable members of City Council, in accordance with the Virginia Beach City Code, Section 2-21, Virginia Code 15.2-1413, and the city's Continuity of Government Ordinance adopted in September 15th of 2020, and Chapter 1289 of the 2020 Acts of Assembly as amended, and by authority vested in me as the mayor of the city of Virginia Beach, I hereby call for a special meeting by electronic means communication and of the City of Virginia Beach Council on Tuesday, February 9th, 2021 at 4 p.m. This special meeting by electronic communication plan will be held virtually with City Council members participating via video audio conference. The purpose of this special meeting is to allow the City Council to hold a regularly scheduled workshop regarding the items listed in the published agenda. The City Council meeting will be streamed live on www.vbgov.com and Facebook Live, and will be recorded for broadcast on cable TV. Sincerely, Bobby Dyer. Okay, at this point, Madam Clerk, we have the roll call of City Council.
Yes, sir. Councilmember Abbott?
Aye.
Councilmember Berlucci?
Present.
Councilmember Henley?
Present.
Councilmember Jones?
Present.
Councilmember Moss?
Present.
Councilmember Tower?
Present.
Councilmember Rouse?
Present.
Councilmember Wilson?
Aye.
Councilmember Wooten?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Wood?
Present.
Mayor Dyer?
Present.
Mayor, all present.
Okay, thank you. And at this point, we'll recognize Amanda Barnes, City Clerk, who will provide the meeting structure and instructions.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, Mayor and members of City Council. This is City Clerk Amanda Barnes. Today's meeting is being conducted electronically and is allowed as described by the Mayor during his reading of the call for special session. Also, please note this meeting is being recorded. To ensure this live electronic event is successful, please note the following meeting instructions must be followed. Speakers, presenters, please mute any additional devices you have in the room to avoid any unnecessary background noise or the possibility of echoing or reverberation. It is important that once recognized, please wait 2 to 3 seconds to begin to ensure council hears your complete remarks. Please begin your comments by identifying yourself. Also, do not ask, "Can you hear me?" as only one feed is open at a time to minimize the echo or reverberation, and as such, you will be unable to hear a response. At the conclusion of each presentation, the Mayor will open the floor for questions and comments. Council members will be recognized in the order which they raise their virtual hand. It is important that council members hold their comments until recognized. Also, it is helpful for council members to ask all questions and end by stating you will stand by for answers. This helps to ensure all questions are answered before I move to the next council member. Lastly, please lower your virtual hand at the conclusion of your remarks. Mayor and members of council, are there any questions about this process? If so, please raise your virtual hand. Seeing none, Mayor, I'll turn the meeting over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. Okay, at this point, we're going to go into City Council briefings, and the first item for discussion will be evolving hurricane risk in the U.S. and Virginia Beach. And, Mr. Moss, thank you so much for bringing this forward. Would you do us the honor of introducing Dr. Kerry A. Emanuel?
Moss?
I certainly would. I've spent a lot of time looking at his work. I think it speaks for itself. I think you'll find the briefing very educational, as it talks about, as I've mentioned many times, that the risk that we are facing is a different risk than in history, and that time is not on our side, and bold capital investments and policy changes are required to be prepared for the future. And I look forward to the professor's work. I think it's a little bit different than the traditional stuff that you would see in some of the journals, but it's very data-based. And I think it shows sometimes why linear analysis isn't always the best analysis. So with that, I turn it over to the good professor or to you, Mr. Mayor, to start the brief.
Dr. Emanuel, if you would just pause 2 to 3 seconds before beginning your comments, thank you.
Okay, I hope you can hear me, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, even if it's just virtually, to talk about evolving hurricane risk in the United States, but with a focus on Virginia Beach. And I'd like to say that we're in an interesting time scientifically, because we are having to get away from using strictly historical statistics to estimate risk and to actually bring in physical means of estimating risk. And I'll explain what that means. Next slide, please. So I would argue that current risk estimates that are being used for planning are in many cases flawed for, I think, somewhat obvious reasons. Almost all of the current risk assessments are based on history. That's the first thing one would do in trying to estimate risk, is to look at historical statistics. Now, the problem for certain phenomena, including hurricanes, is that the historical records don't go back very far. They're flawed, they're too short, and if you get outside North America, it's actually quite a bit worse in the most part. Even if we had very good statistics, the past 50 to 150 years that those statistics are usually based on turn out to be a poor guide to the present risk owing to climate change that has already occurred. And it's one of the most important points I want to make to all of you, and I do this routinely now in seminars, is it's not about the future anymore, although of course it's also about the future. There's been enough climate change to have basically made obsolete a lot of current estimates of risk. And so we need to update the risks that we're facing right now. And the industry, the risk modeling industry, in my view, has been quite slow to migrate to a physics-based approach, which tries to get around a strict reliance on historical statistics. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on hurricane flood risk in this talk. Next slide. And I'd like to put this in the global context, and then we'll narrow it down to Virginia Beach. So if you look at the years since 1971, on average around the world, about 15,000 people lose their lives to hurricanes. And since 1971, about a little over $1 trillion 2015 US dollars in damages globally. It amounts to about $21 billion a year. And this is very disturbing to us. The global population exposed to hurricane hazards has tripled since then. Now, of course, the general population hasn't gone up that much, but people are all over the world migrating into more risky hurricane-prone regions. Next slide, please. So if we look at tropical cyclone damage, we see a big upward trend. This is damage per world gross domestic product. So every year we tally up tropical cyclone damage, and then we divide by the world domestic product of that year. And you can see that there's been a big upward trend, a 380% increase since 1970. Now, most of that is population driven. It's not climate change. Not all of it is. A lot of it is just what I said. A lot of people are moving to risky places, and that accounts for about 200%. So there's still an indication here that some of this may be due to climate change. Next slide, please. So what are the risks? Well, when one mentions the word hurricane, usually we think of a big windstorm, and of course they are that. But they're also, they also create torrential rains and a storm surge, which very few people really have a good appreciation of, but it is the same phenomenon as a tsunami, except that it's been excited by wind rather than shaking ground. And it arrives in the middle of a storm. It's no joke, and it's a leading killer amongst hurricane risks. Next slide, please. So if we look at just the United States, we look at deaths from hurricanes from 1970 to 1990. This chart shows that most of them are drowning in fresh water. Okay, and the second most deadly thing is drowning in salt water. That's the storm surge. And wind itself, it doesn't account for very much. And then there are other things. There are tornadoes spawned by hurricanes, and there are accidents and other things. But the big killers in hurricanes are water. Now, the interesting thing is that in the United States, and in fact in many places, water damage and mortality is publicly insured. Whereas wind damage is usually privately insured. So the private insurance industry has put a lot of effort into quantifying wind damage and almost no effort into quantifying water damage, but water damage is what we have to really worry about. Next one, please. Now we can ask the question empirically, is hurricane risk changing? Next slide, please. Well, there are some disturbing indications of that. Back in 1987, we predicted that hurricanes should become more intense. That was a theoretical prediction, but now we're beginning to see it in data. So what you see on this chart, and this is around the world, is the proportion of satellite observations of hurricanes that fall into the category of major hurricanes, that is category 3 and up. So this is the fraction of category 3 to 5 hurricanes relative to all hurricanes. And you can see a very substantial upward trend in that fraction, an upward trend that was predicted 30 years ago, we're seeing in the data. Next slide, please. The other interesting thing is that hurricanes around the world are reaching their peak intensity at higher latitudes. So the chart at the top shows over time from 1980 to about 2012 or so, the distance north of the equator in the northern hemisphere where storms are observed by satellite and also by other means to reach their peaks. The lower chart's the same thing for the southern hemisphere. In both hemispheres, storms are reaching their peak further toward the poles. And unfortunately, that's not good news because of the distribution of population centers relative to these hurricane regions. Next chart, please. Now, we who work, as I do, in theory of hurricanes know that there is a thermodynamically determined upper bound on how strong their winds can be. Now, not that many hurricanes get to this bound, but it's a very easy bound to calculate from climate data. We don't need hurricanes around to calculate the bound. And this shows from climate data from 1979 to 2018, the upward trend in this upper bound on hurricane intensity. And it's only shown where the trend meets a particular statistical significance threshold. And what one can see is in the hurricane-prone regions of the tropical Atlantic, Eastern tropical Pacific, Western tropical Pacific, Indian Ocean, that there are significant upward trends in this bound, which again were predicted back in 1987. Next slide, please. Now, what do we take away from these sort of global aspects of it? Well, this bound is predicted to increase. It is increasing. And we expect the incidence of high intensity hurricanes should go up with that bound, and we do see it going up. The other thing that theory tells us very straightforwardly is that a given hurricane in a warmer climate will produce more rain, about 7% more for a 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature. The other point is that sea level is going up, and that together with increasing storm intensity indicates increasing risk of storm surges. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to get into the new thing scientifically, and what we're brought to bear on your particular problem in Virginia Beach is how do we use actual physical models to estimate hurricane flood risk, given that history is no longer a particularly good guide to the present. Next slide, please. So of course, one of the tools we have is the global climate model. And I'm sure you've heard about those and know something about them. There are many of them around the world, but they all share the same problem when it comes to hurricanes, is that they're not yet powerful enough. They're too coarse to do a good job simulating hurricanes. So we have to do something a bit different. Next slide, please. So what we do at MIT is we do something called downscaling, and it's not difficult to understand. We begin with a good record of climate on sort of a coarse scale, not including hurricanes. And we cull from those data sets, those climate data sets, the key statistics that are known to control tropical cyclone, which includes hurricane behavior. And we bootstrap these to create a potentially unlimited synthetic time series of those large-scale environmental variables, and then use those to drive a very specialized high-resolution physical hurricane model of the kind we actually use to forecast real hurricanes in real time. And then, of course, the hard job is, once you've done that, why should you be at all confident in the results? And we try to evaluate them very carefully when we run this in the historical period against actual historical hurricane data to see how well it does. And once we've done all that, we can just take that method and apply it to the output of climate models. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, when we do this, so for the North Atlantic, we get a pretty good distribution of storm intensity. So what we're seeing on this chart is the number of times per year that we have North Atlantic hurricanes whose lifetime peak wind speed exceeds the value you see on the bottom axis. The blue is from actual historical hurricanes, and the red is from this technique I very briefly described that we're going to apply to Virginia Beach. And we get the whole sort of statistical distribution of intensity. We get the strong storms, which are much rarer, of course, as well as the weak storms. Next slide, please. So for this talk, I generated a set of these synthetic tropical cyclones, and I'm showing you just 50 of 4,400 of these synthetic storms that affected Virginia Beach. And this was downscale from a climate analysis generated by the National Centers for Environmental Prediction. So those little blue dots are where the storm is formed. Then they have their tracks. They're color-coded by how strong they are. And you can see, if you look very carefully, that most of the hurricanes that affect Virginia Beach come from the south or southwest. Now what I'm going to do is to superimpose on that the very few historical events we have that did affect Virginia Beach on the next slide. And that's in the sort of pink or magenta color. If you can squint and see that, those are the historical events superimposed on the synthetic events. Now, of course, we have to do much more rigorous statistical tests than what you're seeing here, but just to give you a feeling for that. And the next slide. Now, this is not just 50 randomly selected synthetic tracks, but they're the top 50 in terms of the wind speeds they produce in Virginia Beach. So I'm now showing you just the really strong storms from amongst the 4,400 we generated. And what you might notice, and it might not surprise you, is that all of the really strong ones are coming from the southeast, not from the southwest. Those are the ones that don't really pass over a lot of land before they get to you. And so those are the ones we would particularly worry about. Next slide, please. Now, what do we expect the effects of climate change to be broadly, globally? I mean, in the end, it's all boils down to what happens locally. But as the climate warms, we have more water vapor down low in the atmosphere. And that means that we should see more rain in general. We expect storms to become stronger. We think we're seeing that actually happening now. On the other hand, the storm's inner core tend to become more compact as they come strong. That's sort of good news. It means the really bad conditions don't last as long, other things being equal. Unfortunately, we don't know very much about how storm diameters respond to climate change. This is a very active area of research. It's possible they would get larger, but we don't know that for sure. And of course, storms may be moving faster or slower, and that will depend very much on where you are. There's not one global answer to that question. And the next slide. So having done a lot more extensive testing than I've been able to show you, we've gained some confidence in that. Now we're going to apply it to climate models run forward over the century. And so what I've done for Virginia Beach is to take 3,000 storms from each of 4 different climate models. Ideally, we'd like to have a lot more than 4, but this is what we had available at the moment. And for each of 2 periods of time. So we have the early part of the late part of the 20th century and the late part of the 21st century. Next one, please. So we'll talk first about wind.
That's so nice.
Next.
Just asking.
And so this chart is a chart that shows for the end of the 20th century in blue and the end of the 21st century in red, the expected annual frequency of winds at, actually this is at Norfolk, not at Virginia Beach, in miles per hour. So the way to read that chart, if you look at the blue dot in the upper left, you'll see that maybe once every 10 years, you should experience winds of over maybe 55 miles per hour from a tropical cyclone. Now, the line and the blue dots are the average among those 4 models that were used for this. And the shading is the scatter among the models. And that shading, that scatter becomes pretty large as you get out to higher wind speeds. And that reflects the fact that climate models are by no means perfect. They're far from perfect. They differ from each other. And that's, of course, we would like that not to be the case, but that is the case. We have to deal with uncertainty. Risk always entails some uncertainty. Now, the red curve has exactly the same interpretation, but it's for the end of this century, 2080 to 2099. And that's assuming that we do very little to curb emissions globally. So it's sort of a pessimistic climate scenario. And the shading is even broader, indicating that when you go out to the future, models disagree more even. But if we look at the model mean, what that would say is that roughly we would see 100 miles per hour at the end of the 20th century in Norfolk every 600 years, essentially never. Maybe once, very, very low probability of that kind of event. But at the end of this century, 100 miles per hour might be experienced every 80 years. So it's an increase in the frequency, but there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And we'll go to the next slide, please, and talk about rain. Next one. And so this is an example of something went wrong with the graphics, but that's not too bad. This is an example of the storm total rainfall from just one of these synthetic events that came up from the south, passed over far eastern North Carolina, and then over far eastern Virginia. If you follow that black line with the red dots, those red dots are evenly spaced in time. And you can see that this particular storm decided to stall right off of Virginia and dumped a lot of rain. And I'm sorry about the graphics not coming off, but I think it's something like 15 inches of rain or so that this is a very intense rain event for Virginia Beach. Next slide, please. So this is the same kind of chart I was showing you before, but it's for rain rather than for wind. Now, of course, what we'd really like to do is to take the next step and turn the rain into a flood depth, but we haven't taken that step yet. So the blue is for the end of the 20th century, the red for the end of this century, the shading is the scatter among the models, which is large. But we get much more spectacular increases in rain than in wind for the reasons I described earlier. So a 10-inch rainfall at Norfolk would be almost unheard of in the end of the 20th century, about a 400-year event. But by the end of this century, it could be, once 4 times a century, something like that. So this is a problem if there's a problem with fresh water flooding. Next slide. Now, the thing that worries us most about the Chesapeake and other areas is the problem of storm surge. And if I could have the next slide. Here, what we do is now that we have these thousands of synthetic hurricanes, we run them over a ocean model, which is designed to predict storm surges. And there are various different kinds of models. I'm showing you just for fun the computational grids we used for two different models when we did a study for the Battery in Manhattan, New York City, a surge analysis. We did a lot of work on Manhattan, ironically, just before Sandy hit. But I won't be talking obviously about that today. And we applied the same methodology to various different places, including the Chesapeake. Next slide. Now, as you may be aware, in the lower Chesapeake region, you have an unusual problem in that the sea level itself is going up faster. This is measurements now. This is not a model. It's going up faster than just about anywhere else. So this is from 1880 to 2010 or something like that, showing at the bottom the global mean sea level going up about 20 centimeters relative to what it was in 1880. And in Newport and Narragansett Bay up to the north, it's going up a little bit faster. But in Norfolk, it's really going up fast. Now, you probably know why that's true. This is a response to the fact that the land is actually sinking as an indirect consequence of the fact that there was an enormous ice sheet covering places like New England, which of course melted over a period of 10,000 years and relieved the weight on that. So New England is rising. But just like if you put a big rock on a pillow, and of course it depresses that, but around the rock, the pillow rises. And then when you take the rock off, the pillow around where the rock was sinks. That's what's happening to you. And so you have a double whammy. You've got sea level going up, you've got it going up faster than normal. And on top of that, you may be having a bigger problem with hurricanes. Next slide. So I have to tell you that the curve on the right-hand side is tentative. The rightmost curve is tentative. This is the largest expected or I should say the 100-year storm surge in Virginia Beach that we get out of this technique for the end of the 20th century in the left bar, about 3 feet. That is, in the climate of the late 20th century, we would expect a 3-foot storm surge in Virginia Beach about once in 100 years, or the annual probability about 1%. And then that goes up to, at the end of this century, if we don't curb emissions, to something like 5.5 feet. That's without sea level rise. And if you put sea level rise on top of that, you're getting closer to 9 feet. Now, unfortunately, the folks who did that for me forgot to tell me exactly what they used for sea level rise. So I would take the last curve with a grain of salt. It could be more, it could be less. We'll try to get that ironed out, but that's what I had when I put this together. Next one, please. Now I want to just sort of end up by an effort that may be of tangential interest to you to try to bring these risks down to the level of people. And this is actually happening, and you may or may not be aware of it. So sometimes when people are interested in selling their house or buying a house, they'll go to these websites like realtor.com to look for a piece of property. Now I went looking and I pretended I was interested in Virginia Beach, which I might be someday, who knows. But here's a house that I couldn't afford, but there's a house that happens to be on a waterway. And you know, it has all kinds of information about the house. And if you look in the lower right, this is new. There's something called the flood factor. It's 6 out of 10. It has a pretty high flood risk. And if you clicked on that, drilled down, go to the next page, please. Then you start to see the details of this. That this is using physical modeling to estimate how what flood risk is actually now currently in Virginia Beach and how it might evolve. So what you're looking at, the bottom bar chart, is for this particular house, the probability of having 6 inches of water in your building over time. And by 30 years, it's a pretty high probability, 72%. And in fact, if you look at the far upper right, you see that there are a lot of properties that are sort of at flood risk in Virginia Beach from this point of view. So people looking for property are going to start seeing things like this, which will tell them something about the risk they're taking in purchasing that property. Next one, please. And this is my last slide. This is what I hope to be the sort of takeaway points. The big one being is we can't any longer regard climate change as something that's going to happen in the future. It's already tangibly affected important risks. For example, in Texas, Harvey's rainfall was estimated by 3 different groups to have been 3 times more likely to occur when it actually did occur in 2017 than if it had happened in 1970. That's a lot of change and risk. The risk of hurricane winds and heavy rains seems to be increasing in Virginia Beach and is projected to do so through the century. Sea level is rising faster in the Chesapeake region than elsewhere along the US coast. And the 100-year surge event, about 3 feet today, could be 9 feet at the end of the century, again, with the provision that I need to do a little bit more work on that 9 number. So thank you very much.
Okay, any questions for the doctor? Thank you very much for that informative presentation. Any questions or comments from council members?
Councilmember Moss, if you would just pause 2 to 3 seconds. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the professor for a very illuminating briefing that's data-based, and that I think does accentuate that time is not our friend, and it takes a long time to make the investments we need to make to prepare for today and for the future. But what I'd be interested in, and this is something maybe Mr. Haney could follow up with the professor on, to what extent the data model that we use, which is a government model that we've modified and we've validated against actual rainfall events and flooding in our own city, could serve as some kind of input or some supplement to the model that would give us maybe some better refinement as we make our case and apply for grants at the federal and state level for the sea level rise portion, and would allow us to a better insight as to how to integrate our flood investments to better complement what we need to do for sea level rise. That's which is a longer term horizon, but not as long as you think. And also, I think that how we can, at our end, maybe improve the graphics and add this to part of the tutorial for our larger public as we move forward, to educate them as to the risk we're trying to buy down, how risk it really is, and also how long it takes communities to recover that incur those typical events sooner than they would have thought. That would be helpful. But again, I appreciate very much the work that he did to bring that a little bit closer to home. But I think it does show you that things can move on a faster scale than what we think, and that we need to act with speed. That's it. No questions, just some observations. And thank you again very much.
Any additional questions or comments? If so, please raise your virtual hand. Mayor, seeing none, I'll turn the meeting over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Dehaney, at this point, we're on to city manager briefings.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, as I've been doing for the past several weeks, I'm going to give you a brief update on our Vaccinate Virginia Beach efforts. So as I said before, this will be a brief update. As of noon today, there are around 73,000 registrants in the pre-registration portal. We have 3 large clinics this week and a small health equity clinic scheduled for Saturday. With these, we expect to have vaccinated over 27,000 people through the city-partnered pod. That includes people from both 1A and the 1B tiers, but does not include the doses being provided through Centera and other providers. With those doses included, we should be over 50,000 vaccinations this week and nearly 10,000 people fully vaccinated, meaning those 10,000 have got both their shots, their first and their second shot. While this is progress, we all know that this is still too slow for our standards and anybody else's standards. The insufficient vaccine supply continues to be a major issue for everyone. However, there is a bright spot with CVS beginning to offer the vaccine. The Virginia Department of Health has announced this afternoon that CVS Pharmacies has begun registering Virginians aged 65 and older who are within the Phase 1B eligibility guidelines for vaccination as part of the federal retail pharmacy program for COVID-19 vaccination. As of today, eligible individuals can register at the CVS website. I sent you all more details on the actual web link via email right before the meeting. Those without online access can contact CVS at their customer service line at 800-746-7287. Walk-in vaccinations without an appointment will not be provided. CVS will begin administering vaccinations on Friday, February 12th. Pharmacy companies receive their vaccines directly from the federal government through the partnership program I previously mentioned, so this does not impact our allocation from the state. To meet the vaccination needs of the most vulnerable populations impacted by COVID-19, those people over 65 and those between 16 and 64 with comorbidities, city staff is continuing to assist the health department with the Health Equity Task Force and plans for staffing vaccination microsites around the community to help reach out to our underserved and vulnerable populations. The first of these events will be a pilot, which will be held on Saturday, February 13th at Enoch Baptist Church. This will target the Lake Edward and Bayside communities. Going forward, we may look at using recreation centers or other similar sites for these smaller targeted community vaccination clinics. Just an update on the PrEP model before I complete the briefing. The state and the Virginia Beach Health Department continues to address the issues involving the state's recent transition to the new scheduling system called PrEP Mod. The links can be shared. As I said before last week, apparently the links can be shared so people think they are registering, but they are not because there is only one registration honored per link. They are working to fix this so the link doesn't allow more than one use. I will continue to update you on our efforts and welcome your suggestions and comments.
Mayor, Vice Mayor Wood has his virtual hand raised. Vice Mayor Wood.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Patrick, can you give us an idea, or do you know the quantity that CVS is going to be getting in Virginia or in Virginia Beach or in even Hampton Roads? And then also, is there any update? Are we still at 5,000, 5,200 doses a week, which clearly isn't going to get us to where we need to be? Is there any update on increasing that? If you could just let me know, I'd appreciate it.
Mayor, I didn't have all that information with us at the time of the briefing, but I'll work to get that. I'll get the information related as much as I can find out about what CVS is allocated and then our specific numbers as well.
Vice Mayor Wood, any other questions?
No, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Berlucci.
Thank you. Mr. Duhaney, I just wanted to raise an issue that recently came to my attention that I think it would be good to get an update on, and that is the vulnerability of people with disabilities. I recently had a conversation with a person who runs an organization that serves people with disabilities, and during that course of that conversation, I learned that this is a particular problem for many Virginians because people with disabilities are much more likely to get seriously ill or even to die if they contract COVID. And I haven't heard any information or updates about if people with disabilities are being prioritized along with people who are 65 or older or people with medical conditions, and how vaccines are being distributed to those individuals, in particular those who have challenges with mobility. In some cases, people with disabilities are contracting COVID from the people who serve them, and while the people who serve them may have access to, as healthcare workers may have access to vaccines, people with disabilities, especially those who are not 65 or older, in many cases do not have access to the vaccine. And I wonder if we could receive an update about that from Dr. Lindsay, or if you have any information, or if this has been something that's been on your radar at all, and if we can somehow accelerate some attention to this question. Thank you.
Councilmember Bellucci, yeah, that's a question that we are working with the health department to address. You know, it's one of the reasons why we mentioned that the health department, we're working with the health department to set up a health equity task force and a vulnerable population task force. You know, it's something that I think is on the forefront of Dr. Lindsay's minds, and they're working on solutions on how to address that. And we're standing ready and willing and able and to be a part of that conversation and help her to operationalize that as we move forward. But it is definitely something that is at the forefront of Dr. Lindsay's minds and our minds, and we're working to assist the health department in addressing that. I'll send out more information as it relates to that as I learn more. And it's part of the reason why we're trying to set up some of these microsites to get closer into the community so individuals with mobility concerns can have a more accessible vaccination pod that they can get to as well. But we are working with the health department to think of creative ways to get to individuals that have concerns as it relates to mobility and disability that makes it impractical for them to leave their homes for the vaccine.
Councilmember Moss.
I just wanna, I know all council members feel this way, compliment Mr. Dehaney and his team for all that they've done to try to close that last logistical mile, so to speak, between the state's ability to plan and logistically execute, and also and getting the shots in arms. I know it's a great cooperative effort, but I think a lot of people wish we could go faster, and so do I. But I do think I want to acknowledge, I know we all do, just how much the city staff, on top of the day-to-day business of the city, because this is a top priority, has stepped up to the plate and made a big effort and a big difference in closing the gap.
Vice Mayor Wood, I just got an update from our EMS chief, and it looks like for this week we're anticipating around 2,000 vaccines, and then we hope next week will be around 5,000. So it's 2,000 this week for our Virginia Beach pod, and about hopefully 5,000 next week. But I'll keep you posted as I find out more, if I could get more information on the CVS number, sir.
Any additional questions or comments by council members? If so, please raise your virtual hand. If not, we'll move on to the next topic on the agenda. Mayor?
Okay, just one quick comment, just to let everybody know, I did wait in line, and your 7-decade-year-old mayor got his shot yesterday. And I have to compliment the process and the efficiency, the volunteers, the positive spirit of everyone, you know, from the time you walk through the front door till the time you registered, till the time you got the shot, the people walk around the waiting room. I tell you what, it was truly the spirit of Virginia Beach in a positive way. Professionals, volunteers, all coming together. What a great team, Mr. Dehaney. Should be proud. Thank you. Okay, we're ready to move on.
Mr. Mayor, members of council,
I apologize, City Manager and Mayor. Ms. Wilson, Councilmember Wilson has just raised her virtual hand.
Thank you, not to hold things up, but I, like the mayor, got mine yesterday too, and it was remarkable how quickly it all happened. I mean, there was no waiting. You went right through the system. And I saw people that I knew who were their volunteers checking your ID. I mean, they weren't medical people. They were just regular folks doing some of the other things that needed to be done. And everybody was so friendly and nice. And it was a other than getting a shot in your arm, it was a really good, it was a really good experience. So I was so proud of my city. Absolutely. Thank you.
Any additional questions or comments from Council members? Seeing no additional virtual hands raised, I'll turn the meeting back over to you, Mayor.
Mayor, members of council, at this time, our legislative affairs liaison, Deborah Bryan, will update council on the 2021 General Assembly session, including council's legislative agenda items, our add-on bills, and other bills of interest. After the briefing, staff will be ready to answer your questions about the current session.
Ms. Bryan, if you will just pause 2 to 3 seconds, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Dyer, members of City Council, Mr. Dehaney. The purpose of this briefing is to give you a mid-session update of the happenings of the General Assembly. Change slide, please. So we're updating our key dates, and as you can see, we do have a couple of items to note. First of all, on February 4th, as you know, the governor issued a proclamation for a special session, which took our 30-day session and made it into a 46-day length session, as is pretty much customary for odd-numbered years. And so it begins on Wednesday, February 10th, which is tomorrow, and that'll begin our 16-day special session. The other item to note here is that this past Sunday would have been Budget Sunday, which is traditionally the Sunday before crossover, where both the chambers go over their budgets. This year, the House and the Senate haven't acted on their revisions to the 2-year budget that the governor introduced in December. The Assembly money committees have delayed the release of their budgets because of the transition between the regular session and the special session that starts Wednesday. They're also waiting to find out how much additional revenue the governor expects the state to collect from income, sales, and other taxes that will support the $47 billion general fund for core government services such as education, public safety, and healthcare. Next slide, please. Okay, a brief run through of the status of the items that were specifically requested by this council. First of all, House Bill 1825, which was our dome site bill that dealt with the financing for the bonds that would allow us to phase the project. That passed the House and also passed the Senate, and that is onto the governor's desk now. House Bill 2080, which was the heart disease for presumption for EMS, was incorporated into a similar bill. It also now includes the local option that we wanted in it, and also includes pretty much everything else that we had asked for, as far as making sure that we could determine if it was part-time, full-time, or who we would like to give these presumptions to. This passed the House 98-0, and it is currently in the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee. House Bill 1860, which was the prescription drug bill obtained by fraud, that was patroned by Delegate Guy. And after some conversations and the wisdom of our delegate, and also the rest of the delegation as to crime bills in general, they referred this to the Crime Commission along with several other bills to try to get them all in sync. So we're awaiting the outcome of that. House Bill 2071 and Senate Bill 1350, which were our companion bills for the transportation prioritization, both were passed. The 2071 passed the House, and it's currently in the Senate Transportation Committee, and then the opposite, Senate Bill 1350 passed the Senate, and that's in the House's Transportation Committee. Both of those are aligned, and they're both expected to go through simultaneously. And those were also underwent a couple of revisions. We had the fortunate circumstance to have the Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Nick Donahue, to help us through those. So those went through well. House Bill 2159, which was the limitation on balloons, passed the House and is now in the Senate Committee of Agriculture, Conservation, and Natural Resources. Next slide, please. Okay, several of the other items, the House Bill 2043, which was the Tourism Authority, Delegate Guy had that tabled in House Cities, Counties, and Towns. The House bills that ended up dealing with small business definition are what came through our city council was the ability to change the definition and also consolidate and make it aligned throughout the rest of the Virginia code so that we would truly have a definition of a small business. And those so far are going well as well. The stormwater supplemental fee was drafted, but we could not find a delegate to patron that. And then the alternate sources to fund mass transit was withdrawn by the patron. They would like some further discussion. So these are items that post-session we will be talking about. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a few of the other items. Our communication tax is still being worked on as a policy provision. We're also working with VML and several other regions so that we can come up with something that makes sense for everyone. The funding for the STEP VA has been included in the state budget. That's another one of those items that we hopefully will get fully funded, and we'll wait to see once the budgets come out. The renovation of Building 2 funding that is currently assigned to Senate Finance and Appropriations. Restoring the K through 12 funding is another one that we are watching and working on once the budget comes out. And then the Hampton University $10 million funding request has been assigned to the House Appropriations Committee. Next slide, please. Okay, the add-on bills that we had been asked to assist with, the outdoor refreshment areas. This bill ended up going into another bill, which was 2266, which was the one that was chosen to move forward. In the end, the outdoor refreshment area bill, they ended up finding a part of the current Virginia code that was able to just be pretty much changed. It renamed local special events license as an outdoor refreshment area license. And it streamlines it and allows the board of directors of the Virginia ABC to increase the frequency and duration of events held under such licenses after an adoption of an ordinance by the locality. So basically it gives us more flexibility. It's enabling legislation, but doesn't direct us to do anything. And that will just be another tool in our toolbox should we choose to use it. Body worn camera system fund was passed and in the Senate, and it's now in the House committee. CPACE passed both the House and the Senate, and that's now on the governor's desk. And the tree canopy bill passed the House and is now in the Committee on Local Government in the Senate. Next, please. The voting rights bills, House Bill 2198, passed the House and is now in the Senate Privileges and Elections Committee. They meet on Tuesdays, but there was no meeting today because of the fact that they were waiting. Everyone was basically waiting until the new session starts tomorrow, or the special session starts tomorrow. House Bill 1890 passed the House, and that is now in the Privileges and Elections Committee in the Senate, the same one. And Senate Bill 1395 passed the Senate and is now in the House Privileges and Elections. It was supposed to meet tomorrow at 6:15 p.m., but now I've just received notice that it'll be 5:15 p.m. So we will be tracking those closely and keeping you informed about those. Next, please. These are just a few of the additional bills that came up that I believe would maybe of interest to you. First, in the COVID bill, House Bill 2330, which we were asked by the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission to support. This one passed that both the House and the Senate unanimously. This was an emergency bill, and basically this bill allows the pool of the people who are eligible to vaccinate to be much larger. There was also, we had heard about people who would have been able to give the vaccines but had their licenses or their certifications had lapsed. So perhaps maybe a doctor who is retired or something. Well, they have extended that to up to 20 years. So anyone who's been either a healthcare provider or someone who would have been eligible, but their license lapsed, as long as they were in good standing and it lapsed within the last 20 years, that is an eligible vaccinator under the new law. And they also have added a lot of flexibility to vaccination sites. And also the governor put in within the bill was something that he championed. He didn't put it in, but he championed that it also mandates race and ethnicity data collection at the COVID sites. As far as the marijuana bills, the House and the Senate were both in support of legalization of marijuana, but there were differences in their approach between both the chambers, which has left some uncertainty about what's going to happen with this legislation. The Senate supports legalizing simple possession this summer, but the House does not. So neither chamber has yet fully grappled with the creation of a market for legal sales. So any resolution on those remains to be seen. Next slide, please. Okay, and I'll stand by for any questions.
Any questions or comments by council?
The first member of council is Vice Mayor Wood, and after Vice Mayor Wood will be Councilmember Moss.
Well, thank you, Ms. Bryan. That was a very, very detailed report. I wanted to touch base with you on a couple of things. You know, obviously we had the issue with legislation that targets Virginia Beach that we didn't know about, and Ms. Henley and I actually had a discussion earlier this week and last week too, talking about the way that we used to interact with our delegation. We used to have, you know, dinners and events and things like that, and they would come, or if they couldn't come, you know, they would send an aide or something like that, and that just kind of tapered off. I know that they're not governed by the same open meeting rules that we are, and some of them didn't like the fact that the media was there. But you know, I think it's something that we certainly need to do, and this is more of an editorial comment, not a question for you, but I think it's something we need to talk about. Is I think we need to go back to having, you know, ideally quarterly meetings with the members of the delegation. Hopefully they'll attend, and if they can't attend, they'll send an aide or somebody like that, so we can at least open up the lines of communication. Because, you know, again, that's a major issue with certainly the one bill we've been talking about that kind of targets Virginia Beach. But I kind of wanted to drill down a little bit into your philosophy and your strategy, new in this job. How do you reach out to these folks, to the legislators? Are you getting a good reception from the delegation? Are they, you know, working with you, cooperating with you, that sort of thing? So anything that you can share about how you do that and what kind of reaction you're getting, I think would be helpful. Thank you.
Ms. Bryan?
Thank you, Vice Mayor Wood, for the question. And also, that is one of my goals, to really work to facilitate that and to facilitate what you all desire to have, which would be, you know, more of a relationship with our delegation. Obviously, in this current climate with COVID and the inability to get together, it really does make it much more difficult. I can tell you that on January 6th, which was before the session started, our lobbyists did set up a meeting for them to meet me, knowing that I was new. And so it was wonderful that several of our delegates took the time to do that. And some of them were unable to. And, you know, we understand that. There was about 4 or 5 who were able to. And they all were very forthcoming with what they were doing. They were very happy to tell us not only what they were doing for us, but also what they were doing for several of their, you know, other areas. And we made the commitment to them that, you know, we would assist them in any way we could with the other things that they had going on. Of those, there was also Delegate Guy who could not attend that session, so she made a special accommodation on the 11th. I met with her as well. And in between that, I've done a lot of trying to email them, again, not ideal, and talk to any of them on the phone that I'm able to, and as well as their aides. So I think that is a process. And unfortunately for this General Assembly session, I didn't really have a lot of time to do that. But I commit to all of you and to all of our delegation that will be a priority, because I totally believe that our communication among all of us is important to get done what we need to get done for our constituents.
Vice Mayor Wood, did you have any additional questions or comments?
Yeah, so then this one particular bill that we're talking about, that wasn't, was that shared with you in advance or was it not? That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Ms. Bryan?
Yes. Yes, no, that was not shared with us, myself or our lobbyists in advance. That did not come up until the 13th, which was the day that it was dropped. After that, we reached out to the delegate and to the aides to try to get some information about it. And that really, at that point, I think everyone was really embroiled in everything. And so, anything that was necessary, we were told to, just because of the shortness of time, to have any city council member could reach out directly. So no, we did not know about any of those bills beforehand.
Councilmember Moss, and then after Mr. Moss will be Councilmember Tower.
I wanted to address the House and the Senate Voting Rights Act bill. And you mentioned about the marijuana bill, about how there are differences. So my first question, and I have a couple more, are those mirrors of each other, or are there substantive differences between those two bills, or just different sponsors and they pass the very same bill both places? That's question one. Question two, a bill you didn't address, and I don't know the bill number on top, but it's a Senate bill that allowed for the creation of tourist districts as 5013C4, I think, or C6 nonprofit organizations had determined there that they have to generate 50% of the funding within the members of the district. But I didn't hear the comment on that. I'd like to get a copy of that bill, and I'd like to get something back from our lobbyist and from you as to just what that bill is and what it means to us. But that was something that I know cleared the Senate, but it's going on to the House. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that bill. Not today, obviously, because you got to do some homework, but I would like to hear more about that. That's my two questions, and I'm done.
Ms. Bryan?
So both the bills, so as I mentioned, the marijuana bills have significant differences in them. So that will take coordination. But both of the voting rights bills, which would be House Bill 1890 and Senate Bill 1395, are identical. And so the one that was passed in the Senate and the one that was passed in the House are identical. Even though there were substitutions, every time there was a substitution, it was also made on the House side. So that's the first one. And then for the tourist bill, I can certainly do some research and get with you on that.
Councilmember Moss, did you have additional questions or comments?
I do. Does that mean that House voting rights bill will then move on to the governor's desk for signature like the other bills? It's just passed the same in both houses. You didn't make that reference, but I assume that's true.
Ms. Bryan?
No, actually, both of them still have to. So the House bill is in the Privileges and Elections Committee in the Senate, and the Senate bill is in the House Privileges and Elections Committee. So both of them will go to the committee first.
Councilmember Moss, any additional questions or comments?
No, but I would think that would be, no question, but I think that would be fairly academic at this point, and we should expect that bill to be approved and signed by the governor. Thank you.
Councilmember Tower, if you'd pause 2 to 3 seconds before beginning, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. I just want to take a moment to pardon the expression, an atta girl for Ms. Bryan. It is, I found her attention to detail and her attempt to be on top of things, improving every day and getting better. And I think she's doing a very good job. She's acquitting herself well, and we all owe her thanks for the job she does. It's pretty intense during the session. Even though it's done remotely, things are changing rapidly, and she's doing a good job keeping up with things. And I appreciate the work she's doing. Thanks.
Any additional questions or comments from council members? If so, please raise your virtual hand. Mr. Tower, your virtual hand is still raised. Thank you. Mayor, seeing no virtual hands raised, I'll turn the meeting over to you.
Okay, Ms. Brown, I just want to thank you very much for, stepping to the plate, during a transition. And there's no question over the next year or maybe two, we're still going to have some COVID malaise going on. And I concur with Ms. Henley and Mr. Wood's conversation earlier, that we have to do a better job of articulating, with our delegation, and also maybe including, like we used to do back in the day, bringing the school board in, because once again, we have to be in sync together, working as a team, and avoid any type of miscommunication. So the delegation knows where we're coming from. We know where they're coming from. The art of compromise, and we have to do this, I think, before we submit our legislative package. And then hopefully a lot of the bills that are going to be even thought about, would at least come on the radar for discussion. But that being said, Ms. Bryan, do you have any suggestions other than, just meeting about how we can do a better job, as a council and the collective, and working with our delegation as a collective, to improve the overall process?
Ms. Bryan?
Mayor Dyer, I think we are all figuring out how to work together, meaning City Council, myself, our new city manager, and the delegation. And I know we will get there, and I am committed to making that happen and facilitating that process the best that I can. I thank all of you for being receptive to my phone calls, my emails. I know I've pinged on many of you already, and I'm here to do that. So thank you all very much. I think we're going to get there.
And thank you very much. Okay, my colleagues, at this point, I have to adjourn to help out with a family illness situation. So with due respect, I would like to pass the virtual gavel on to my dear friend and colleague, Vice Mayor Wood. Thank you all very much.
City Manager, would you like to go ahead and introduce the next presentation?
Members of council, at this time, our housing and neighborhood preservation staff, they're going to brief council on an item that we previously briefed you on as it relates to concerns raised by our citizens regarding the city's enforcement of the city code surrounding commercial vehicles and residential communities. As part of that briefing, staff proposed changes to the code to address the concerns raised by the citizens, and from there, with council guidance, we engaged in a public input survey process to garner feedback on the proposed changes. This briefing is to update council on the survey and to seek council guidance as it relates to next steps.
Mr. Friedman, if you would just pause 2 to 3 seconds before beginning your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. This is Andy Friedman, Director of Housing and Neighborhood Preservation. I'm just going to introduce the briefing, which is mostly going to be done by Wells Freed, who's our Housing Code Administrator. So we go to the next slide. As Mr. Duhaney said, we briefed you on November 10th about this subject. It was code requirements and issues that had come up, options for amending the code. We did go and obtain what I think is pretty robust public input that Wells is going to share with you. And then based on that input and discussions about what we learned from it, we have some recommendations, that really options for your consideration, which if you give us direction at the end of this meeting, we will be prepared to work with the city attorney and bring back to you at a later date. So I'm going to turn it over now to Wells Freed, who's going to lead you through the presentation.
Freed, if you would just pause 2 to 3 seconds before beginning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Duhaney and members of council. I'm going to jump right in here and just give you the update, sort of what we went over back in November. This is the current city code requirements, and those define a commercial vehicle as a loaded or empty motor vehicle trailer or semi-trailer designed or regularly used for carrying freight, merchandise, or more than 10 passengers, including buses, but not school buses. Next slide, please. So the ordinance prohibits parking of commercial vehicles in residential or apartment zones, but gives 3 exceptions. The first is that one commercial vehicle is allowed on residential property if it's 1 ton or less carrying capacity It does not exceed 7 feet in height or 20 feet in length. And this is really the main exemption or exception that we encounter. The second exception deals with commercial vehicles in residential zones conducting normal business. And the third is for parking of commercial vehicles on bona fide construction sites. Next slide, please. Violations of the section do constitute a Class 3 misdemeanor, and the code authorizes the city to institute legal action for continuing violations. Next slide, please. I included this code, this slide here with the City Code Section 21303, which is enforced by the police department, so that council is aware that parking of these larger vehicles is prohibited. We're not proposing any changes to this particular ordinance, but parking these types of vehicles in the public street is prohibited. Next slide, please. The history of this ordinance per the planning department is that a code restricting parking of commercial vehicles in residential areas has been in effect in the city of Virginia Beach since 1973. The ordinance is in place to maintain consistent property use and appearance in residential and apartment zones. And the Department of Housing took over enforcement in 2011, utilizing the same restrictions that the zoning division of the planning department was using at that time. Next slide, please. So these are examples of two types of commercial vehicles that currently are allowed in residential zones: a small cargo van without racks that does not exceed 7 feet in height, and a small walk-in type of a van that is less than 20 feet long and 7 feet high. Next slide. These are examples of the types of commercial vehicles that are currently prohibited from being parked in residential areas. These would be larger walk-in style vans, cargo vans with racks where they exceed 7 feet high, open flatbed trailers, enclosed trailers, box and delivery trucks, step vans, dump trucks, and semi-truck tractor sleeper cabs. Next slide, please. We also identified that there's similar types of vehicles that have different restrictions, and this is an example of that. This is essentially a large walk-in type of van. However, it's designed and built to be a motorhome. These types of vehicles are permitted to be stored on residential property when they're stored behind the front planes of the home. And unlike commercial vehicles, which may be used regularly or daily, recreational vehicles are normally stored on residential property for extended periods of time while they're not being used. Next slide, please. So with regards to the public input process, we implemented an online survey that ran from December 7th to December 18th. We had 2,800 participants and almost 8,500 comments. The format and questions included showing examples of commercial vehicles currently prohibited under the code, and then asking the participants, should the ordinance be amended to allow different types of vehicles on residential property? We also gave examples of restrictions, what could be considered for those, which could be the side or rear yard of a property. We also asked the participants if they own commercial vehicles and what other concerns they had regarding any proposed changes. Next slide, please. But going into the results, the first one is the cargo van with racks where the total height exceeds 7 feet. We had 43% of the participants say that these vehicles should not be allowed, no exceptions. We had 27% saying that they should be allowed with restriction, and then 30% stated that they should be allowed with no restriction. Next slide. With regards to the large walk-in, which was sort of the main focus of our November 10th briefing, was that we had 52% of the participants indicate that these types of vehicles should not be allowed, no exceptions, 26% with restrictions, and 22 with no restrictions. Next slide, please. So from here, the numbers kind of go up. So we really maintain focus on the large walk-ins and the cargo vans. However, we'll review this with you so you can see the results. The open flatbed trailers, they were at 57% with no exception, 28% with restrictions, and 15 with no restrictions. Next slide. Enclosed trailers, 58%, no exceptions, 26% with restrictions, and 16% allowed with no restriction. Next slide. Thank you. The delivery box truck, 72% of the participants indicated that they should not be allowed, no exceptions, 17% with restrictions, and 11% no restrictions. With the step vans, 73%, no exceptions, 14 allowed with restriction, and 13% allowed with no restriction. And then the semi trucks, 82%, no exception, 12% with restrictions, and 6% no restriction. And then finally, the dump trucks, 89% with no exception, 6% with restrictions, and 5% with no restrictions. Next slide. Here are some of the concerns raised by the residents who, I think these were for changing the ordinance. So some participants raised concerns with safety and obstructions, traffic issues. However, again, as stated in the beginning, the police department does enforce an ordinance that prohibits parking of these large vehicles in the street. Some raised concerns regarding the negative effect on neighborhood appearance and property values, increased noise and pollution in the neighborhoods, encourages the presence and traffic of commercial vehicles in residential areas. Some talked about parking being limited already, overcrowding, and again, some more comments regarding street parking. And some felt that there was not enough enforcement of the existing ordinances, or that it could be a slippery slope snowball effect if more vehicles are allowed. Next slide. And then these are the comments from participants who were against changing, or who were for changing the ordinance to allow more vehicles. They felt the current ordinance is too restrictive. It could have an impact on small businesses regarding costs and inconvenience for off-site parking. There's the potential for theft and vandalism of vehicles if they're required to be parked off-site. Some felt that the vehicles should be allowed if they can fit on residential property and do not obstruct or impede traffic. They are the only form of transportation for some. Some felt that the city needed to designate safe and affordable off-site parking locations and options. Some felt that the ordinance is outdated and that vehicles have changed design and become taller and higher. And then more small business owners with people working from home during the pandemic had some effect on that. Next slide. So again, we focused on two of the vehicles that had the around 50% or less percentage. And the first one being the cargo van with racks where it exceeds 7 feet. These were some of the comments that we went through. Again, we had about 8,500 comments. 29% wanted restrictions on the number of vehicles allowed. Now, the current ordinance does already limit the number to one vehicle under the size limits. 25% were against street parking for various reasons, including hazards. Some felt that driveway parking was acceptable. 23% agreed to allow parking in the driveway. 14% cited a side yard restriction, and 11% cited a backyard restriction as acceptable. And then we had other comments that didn't really fall into these categories, or that could have had multiple comments that they portrayed. Next slide, please. And these are the comments regarding the large walk-in style van. We had 21% wanted restrictions on the number of large walk-ins allowed. 18% agreed to allow parking in the driveway. 13% cited a side yard, and 11% cited a backyard restriction as acceptable. 14% were against street parking for various reasons. And again, we had comments that did not fall into these categories, such as opposing commercial vehicles altogether or citing additional safety concerns. Next slide. So the recommendations for council to consider today are to continue to prohibit the parking and storage of these large types of commercial vehicles in residential areas under the current ordinance. Next slide. And then to consider several options we've laid out here. The first being for the large walk-in and the cargo style van with racks. Currently, these are considered over the size limits and not allowed on residential property. One option would be to allow one of these types of vehicles without restriction, regardless of use type. The second would be to allow both of these types of vehicles on residential property without restrictions. And of course, option 3 is for council to provide us with direction on another potential alternative change or suggest no changes. And we also wanted council to consider the recreational vehicle shown here that is similar to the large walk-in vehicle. Those are currently allowed on residential property behind the front plane of the home. Option 1 would be to continue that. Option 2 would be to allow those without restriction. And again, option 3 would be to consider alternative changes or no change. And should council decide to amend these ordinances, we will work with the city attorney to develop them, the amendments, and implement those, bring those to council for consideration at a future meeting. So happy to answer any questions or take any comments.
Vice Mayor Wood?
Well, thank you, Mr. Friedman and Mr. Freed. Are there any questions from council?
Council members, if you have questions, please raise your virtual hand. Councilmember Moss?
Mr. Vice Mayor and peers, I don't know that I would want to provide any direction at this time of staff to go to the city attorney, but I think all of us would like the opportunity maybe to get this brief electronically and be able to go out and engage in our respective districts, both with neighborhood civic leagues or HOAs, and maybe get our own sense of additional input. And maybe after that, then maybe have some discussion, but it looks like there's a strong bias to making no changes. But I would like to go out and, formally ask people that have more active civic leagues their thoughts to make sure, especially in my own neighborhood, I don't see a lot of those vehicles per se, but I would like to go out and have a chance to do my own engagement and get my own feedback, and I'm sure other members would as well, before I'd be willing to ask the staff to prepare something. And that's just a thought. I don't know what other people are thinking.
Any additional, Councilmember Wilson?
So the thing is, we don't live in a cookie cutter city where all the driveways and all the yards and all the streets are just the same. And some are smaller and some are larger. I mean, is there any consideration given to the size of the driveway and streets and how crowded a neighborhood is? Because in a really crowded neighborhood, if you had a lot of these things, it could be more problematic than in a neighborhood where things are more spread out.
Mr. Freed?
Yes. So Currently, they're not, they are prohibited from being in the street under both ordinances. Also the one that the police department enforces, but we could definitely look into that if there is a way to do an area-based ordinance.
Wilson, any additional questions or comments? Vice Mayor Wood?
Thanks. Are there any other comments before I make my comment?
Councilmember Wooten just raised her virtual hand. Councilmember Wooten, if you'd pause 2 to 3 seconds, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, I know that when this initial request was first brought up, this request was for a specific resident who was not engaged in business. He just used it for his family to transport them back and forth. And so I'm just reminded of where this started and what the problem was. And I just want to make sure that we address the specific problem instead of casting a wider net than possibly may be needed to open up virtually a can of worms that, we may not want to. So my interest is really getting to the root cause and address the citizens' concern. He specifically had his vehicle parked in his driveway, which was not impeding traffic, which was not taking up anyone else's space, was his personal property. But I think one of the questions that I have is, related to a lot of the questions that were brought up concerning business owners, because, most people may have, a food truck or, some of the other smaller trucks that we have looked at, and they own their own businesses and they do need them to, make a living. And so I think that should be taken into consideration. But as my question is, did we reach out to business owners on that aspect? Did we kind of narrow the focus to make sure that we did also have the input of business owners who own, commercial vehicles to get their perspective? I don't know if there was a way, I don't know if that was done. And if so, is there a way to extrapolate that information so that we can look at that as well?
Mr. Freed?
So we did not target questions specific to business owners. They were specific to the types of vehicles and any concerns that participants had regarding that. However, we did get responses from several business owners that indicated that they do own businesses and they have some of these types of vehicles on their property. We can look at trying to pull out some of that information from the comments.
Councilmember Wooten, any additional questions or comments?
That would actually, that would be great if I could see some of that information. That would kind of help me with the decision-making process. Thank you.
Council members, any additional questions or comments? If so, please raise your virtual hand. Vice Mayor Wood, seeing none, I'll turn the meeting back over to you. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you for the great presentation. I would just echo some things that we heard from both Councilmember Moss and Councilmember Wooten on this. I don't think it's a good idea to go into this just yet based on the fact that we don't have all the information. And I'm a little troubled. I use the common term for one of these vehicles, and it's the one that Councilmember Wooten is referencing, like a transit van, and I guess you call that a large walk-around or something like that. I'm concerned because we're saying that, well, if it's used for, it's the same vehicle, but if it's used as an RV, it's got one set of restrictions. If it's used for a business, it's got another set of restrictions. or if it's used for somebody's personal transportation, it's got a separate set of restrictions. And from the outside, it looks the same if it doesn't have painting or anything on the side of it. So I think we need to be cognizant of that as we go forward. But I think these are all great comments. So thank you very much. And what's our next topic?
I'll turn the meeting over to the city manager. This is for a council discussion. Do you want to start that one, city manager?
Members of council, the next item is city council discussion, and the first item on the city council discussion was the city manager budget guidance memorandum.
Did Patrick? Okay. So this is the city council discussion. So Councilmember Moss, if you would pause 2 to 3 seconds, thank you.
I asked these two topics to be added, and I certainly want to get the stormwater management because that's a very pressing, matter of fact, might be more pressing than this even. But a couple things I hope as we move into the retreat on March 9th, that as we get the additional real estate granular impact and we see that our most affordable homes are the ones getting the biggest biggest appreciation in their tax property, therefore their taxes. I hope we're going to be looking and have some discussions of options for targeted tax relief and which taxes would make the most sense to the people most impacted in our economy, realizing that the impact has not been uniform and some other than others. So I hope we can get that. With regards to police, public safety has been, I think, a concern of all of us over time. We continue to have high vacancies. We have 82 now and 39 in the academy. I've talked with folks, I've talked with the police chief. I hope there's some short-term things that we can do before we get the results back from our total compensation package. Maybe things like recruitment and retention bonuses, maybe recruiting from communities which have less less responsive or less supportive communities towards police. Maybe they'd be willing to relocate. Maybe we need to look at willing to pay relocation costs to fill some of our critical needs so we can staff up appropriately. I hope we're going to be talking about a CIP annex that we would be able to implement if we do a bond referendum and we're successful. I hope we can talk about our compensation strategy in light of having this big total compensation study underway, and that we don't get out ahead of ourselves and then find us not having sufficient resources to implement the results when they come back, and that hopefully that the mayor and vice mayor are chatting with as liaisons to the school board so that we don't have, while we don't have to have compensation parity, and I believe in that, we ought to make sure that we're not going out on a strategy that puts us at odds with building public support later for a successful bond referendum in November. I'm very concerned that we don't send mixed messages regarding that. So I hope we can have some additional data at the retreat or in advance of the retreat, Mr. City Manager, so that we could have some structured choices that maybe we could make so we could go there kind of prepared to say yay or nay or some of these things, or give our informal consent so we could speedily get to saying what we're looking for on that memorandum. I've shared with you my thoughts about, I thought that maybe we should be thinking about holding our compensation dollars in reserve for the study. But I think that ought to be a larger conversation, and maybe a larger conversation about whether or not on some of these issues with police recruitment that we would be doing things for police officers that we wouldn't be doing for others just because they have unique retention and unique attrition issues. And so those are the big points. But this tax relief, I think that shouldn't be off the table in light of what we see that the taxable real estate is coming in over the guidance that the city manager's assumption of the budget was based on. And also we're seeing a large number of our small businesses are still greatly suffering and probably will be through some part of 2022 and 2021 as well. So I hope we can take a look at how we can address that. Those were my general thoughts about the budget guidance. Overall, I thought it was good, but I told the city manager at this point in time, I could not concur with the compensation guidance he was working on in light of the private sector experience and in light of the total compensation study that we had underway.
Any additional questions or comments from council members? If so, please raise your virtual hand. Seeing none, Vice Mayor Wood, I'll turn the meeting back over to you for the next topic, which is the Stormwater Management City Council discussion.
Yeah, that's great. So let's roll right back into that. I see that Mr. Moss has his virtual hand up, so let's start with John.
You would just pause 2 to 3 seconds. Thank you.
I brought this topic up based on 3 recent examples. And the first one I want to start off with, because one we're all familiar with, so I know some questions have been raised about the confidence or what we should expect. This is the Thalia BMP. That's over there by the grocery store. You may recall last summer, this is when, before the current city manager had reported, I brought out pictures that showed this allegedly dry BMP was very wet, that it had been inspected and identified as being not in compliance in 2018, and still wasn't in compliance in 2019, wasn't compliant in 2020. Well, and I said, hey, I wanted to be kept informed of what progressed. So as time went on, because I went by there recently, and before it hadn't rained in over a week, and that thing had enough water in it that ducks were swimming in it. And I shared that picture with the city manager and the staff and said, hey, what's going on with this BMP? I thought this was going to be restored to the dry MP. That's what we were told. What's happened? Well, what happened in all this progression is, first of all, the city still doesn't have copies of the original design calculations or the geotechnical data for infiltration basin of the original BMP when it was installed. And why this is important is we move forward and we're putting a lot of faith in our modeling, but it doesn't mean much if we aren't capturing and maintaining a technical library of the documentation. So I don't know if this is an isolated event. I suspect it's not, but I think that shows you, because I asked, well, did we get the calculation wrong the first time? Did we model it? And then I was told, well, the original compliance was based on the design requirements prior to the Virginia Stormwater Management Act. Well, that was adopted in 2017. So when we inspected it in 2018, it wasn't in compliance. They held off making them comply because that other development might happen. Development didn't happen. And now we're being told it's going to be a wet BMP, but it's going to be better than ever. Well, I only mention this is because when we approve things as a city council, these are normally things we don't ever see. But when they don't work and they get changed, who do you think the public holds accountable? So I think we have to have a much different process of notification and much better technical documentation retention so that we can really be confident that what's being done and then later changed really is better. To go from a dry BMP to a wet BMP is not a small thing. And when you I won't bore you with all the details, but I'm happy to share with anyone who wants it. But this isn't the way I think any of us thought that the implementation would take place, that the underlying requirement would be changed when it wasn't even being enforced, and there would be no kind of notification to us what's happening. That's my first point is, this is the classic case is, what's our ability to enforce? Then we change what we're enforcing, but yet we can't find the underlying documentation for what was originally constructed. Not a good story, in my opinion. Then when you go and look at, I'm sure all of you got the memo on Pinnacle development, on which the staff did an excellent technical review from my point. But what it brings out is when we're voting for a rezoning, as Mr. Jones pointed out when we voted to approve the apartments for Bonaventure, we're not seeing the final design. Because people don't want to quote unquote invest the money to produce the real drainage plan until they know they're going to get their development approved. So what we're approving is preliminary assessment of what should work, not what's actually going to be constructed to meet the standard. And I don't know that that's really where we want to be, or do we get back briefed on what the final thing is before it goes forward? But I think if we're betting the farm, so to speak, on our model, and we're going to spend $1.2 billion of our own money on drainage based on a model assessment and modeling, I think we need more definitive validation of what's actually proved, and we need to see those actual model results as policymakers. I don't think we can just vote and say, oh, well, the staff will take care of it and it'll all work, because I can show you example after example where that hasn't been true. And then when we look, and this gets back to where we need to go forward, I'm sure all of you saw all the photographs we got on the, I'm trying to look here, the actual place, the North Court, or where all the flooding was taking place, and Mrs. Henley's borough down there. And that's current flooding that's happened. It's not isolated. So I don't think, Mr. City Manager, we really need to see more visual aspects of that model, which I've talked about, and show us subdivision by subdivision, these rainstorms, how the system is actually performing, so we know the problem that we supposedly should have solved. So is that system down there, was it built to the design? Why is that system failing to that extent? And so I just think the stormwater, we don't have a handle on our storm water management cause and effect for our as-is system, in my opinion. I don't know why we don't, but it's evident. I'm sure all of you get calls and see it. I think we have a gap between what's really happening and what we know, and makes the public less confident that we know how to solve it when we can't explain the current problems we are having and why the current design that's in place failed. We have got to do a better job. Now, I remember back in the day, and I know Ms. Henley remembers this, when we hired the Surgic Corporation to do the certification on asphalt paving. And I can tell you one thing, the paving jobs we got were much better in terms of compliance under Surgic than later when we brought it back in-house, because they had to be bonded for what they accepted. So we've got to come up with a better way of having independent assessment or independent validation that these projects, when they're done, are actually delivering the results that supposedly they're supposed to. I question the confidence that we are able to do that. And that's a concern. And I think it's going to be difficult for us in our attempt to tell people where we're going forward if we can't do a better job of explaining why what we have is failing and why things like this failure BMP happen. I mean, there's no reason I can go to the Thalia Civic League and give them an explanation that makes sense of how we got here. And we got to do a better job. I know people are working hard. I know we got vacancies, but I'm telling you, I think we need something like Surgic or something like that, someone who's bonded for their analysis, bonded for their acceptance, to bring greater rigor than we are able to internally do for whatever reason on our stormwater management. We are not where we need to be. That's my observation. I think you've all seen those documents. I know people can go there and see that they BMP this day, but that's not a story of success.
Councilmember Abbott?
Thank you. Well, I wanted to touch on something that John said that really is, I think he said it very well, in that it's very hard to, when we do our individual public feedback for any development that comes up, it's very hard to ask questions about what the big picture of these things will do, and therefore makes it very hard to share that information with the public. And I'm increasingly concerned about the accountability component that we have with that, because I don't think that we are I think we're going to start seeing an increase, and particularly in redevelopment applications coming down our way over the next few years and probably for the next decade. And when I don't really feel like when I ask staff, okay, so this redevelopment is going to do this, this, and this, and can you quantify that? Can you show me in the model? Can you give me the, the facts that this will do that? And the answer back is, well, we aren't to that point in the review process. They haven't submitted that site design. They haven't done their stormwater, whatever it is. And then basically it's, but our standards and our policies say they have to do this. So rest assured that that's what's going to happen. And it's really not that I have any lack in staff, that they're not going to try to enforce that. But once we've granted them permission to do the redevelopment, I think it's really hard to take that back and really hard to stop an application once it's already gone through us. So I'm really interested in echo a lot of what John said about how do we make sure we're circling back to say, okay, this redevelopment passed council, we got to their stormwater section or their site plan or whatever it is, and as a result of the conversation and the new information that this is where we're at now and this is what they're going to have to do in order to continue on. And I don't know that it has to be done with every single one, but I think that there needs to be some kind of accountability system set up for us so that if we start hearing from the public, okay, you didn't approve what you thought you approved, or that's not what's happening. And, kind of much like with what happened with Asheville Park. And I just think it discredits us and our judgment. And when we choose to say, okay, well, I think bigger picture here, or I think that this has good potential. How do we fact check that, so to speak, and how do we give the public confidence in that decision? Because I think the future, particularly for a lot of our retail space, which I've said many, many times before, we have a lot of commercial development that didn't have any stormwater infrastructure when it was built originally, and they're coming up on the end of their useful life. And so we're going to be seeing more redevelopment applications in the future. How do we say with confidence to the public, okay, yes, they're not in their stormwater review process yet, but we have this process in place to make sure that if something starts to change from what we originally thought, we're going to be made aware of it quickly, and so that we can kind of act as the double check on making sure the system is moving forward. Or as John suggests, maybe it's somebody outside that we need to bring in. I want to feel confident in those choices, and I know the public wants to be confident in us, and I think we need to add that extra level of scrutiny to make sure that when X, Y, or Z strip mall gets redeveloped and they're going to underground a BMP or whatever it's going to be, that we know that is actually going to help. And I realize that it's a lot to ask somebody to design all that before they know they're going to get it, but we do have a responsibility to the public too. So I really just kind of wanted to add that to it and add my support for encouraging a system that we can really, one, feel good about, and also share with the public so that they can feel good about it too. And if that system already exists, then I would love to be educated on it. So that's all my comments. Thank you.
Councilmember Mall, oh, I'm sorry, you lowered your virtual hand. Any additional questions or comments from council members? If so, please raise your virtual hand. Councilmember Wilson.
Thank you. I think all of us got a long letter and pictures and everything from people that live on Norton Court that's been dealing with flooding and stormwater for years and haven't been able to get it resolved. And I would just like for the staff to get back with us with a response to see how we're going to help the people in this court.
Councilmember Henley, if you would just pause 2 to 3 seconds, thank you.
Yes, I would like to address the Norton Court issue. I believe the staff has been out there, has responded. Perhaps all of you didn't get a copy of that, but the last response I had from the community was they were very glad to see the response they got from Mr. Cutter. And of course, it's going to take a little while to get it done, but I do want you to know that staff has thoroughly examined that and has reached back out to the community, and we're following through. Thank you.
Councilmember Moss.
Thanks, Barbara.
My last comment gets with, because I do believe after physical and personal property and personal public safety, which the police department provides and also our fire department, that flood mitigation is our #1 priority and is our most unfunded requirement in our community. So as we look at the North Court, we look at, you name the place in the city, the entrance on Red Mill Boulevard, I think it is, when people can't get into their home and a heavy rain comes and they got to park and walk to their homes. Or you can name some places in Aragona Village where the drainage doesn't work right and the intersections flood. You can just name the neighborhood and you can name that flooding problem. And then there's just as Michael talks about all the time, it's people would just love to have the current stuff so it works and it's maintained properly and we get the backlog done. So my point in bringing this up as we go into this budget process and we talk about where we can take risk or should take risk to accelerate things that need to be accelerated, like ditch and canal maintenance, that those are the things that we need to make work, the fundamental core requirements that we have. And that's why I brought up under bike trails. I'd love to have bike trails, but until people's homes are dry or that people can get home or get to work when it rains, our roadways, that's our first and foremost thing we have to deal with. And we need to make sure that that the standard that we're applying, that the models that we have, the maintenance of these underground bladders, the maintenance of these membranes, the maintenance of these quote unquote impervious or pervious asphalt, which has to be vacuumed and brushed. All these things are maintenance intensive, that in fact, they're not just, they work at installation, but 5 years later, they don't work. So my only point is we build all this stuff, the life cycle cost of making sure in the system, hopefully more people pay for their own independent compliance check. We just gotta make sure all that stuff works. And I think that's what we all want. So it's not a special John Moss view. I think that's what we hear from all our residents, that, hey, I want to be able to get home from work. I want to be able to get to work. That's more important than a lot of other things we might be talking about, is getting the basic ability. And that's not talking about hurricanes. That's the next big bill coming. And I think we have the right city manager for that. I think we have the right leadership for that. I just think we have to step up and make sure that all the pieces work, and we shouldn't be, and we've used the private sector in the past. I use that example, Surrogate Corporation, to help us with compliance. I think that's a way to go. And also someone else is bonded, so you have someone else in your liability corner. And so that's why I'm bringing this up, because it's in front of our retreat, is just what a big challenge maintenance of this and delivering flood mitigation across our community. Every community has it. It's, over by Crystal Lake, or whether you're talking about over by Little Creek Base, every part of our city has drainage and issues. And it's something that I think we can unite our community behind, but we need to have a competent way of showing how we're going to put those dollars to good use, and we're going to be able to maintain those systems when we have them in place. And we're going to make sure the maintenance comes first before we talk about new, because all that helps. And that was my only point of bringing this up. I know it's not universal to me, but sometimes this conversation can get lost in the issues of the moment, whether it's COVID or whatever. But these are the things day to day when COVID's over that are still going to be facing people. And we won't be able to solve them overnight, but I think we can make material progress in this budget and subsequent budgets, and hopefully with the successful bond referendum in November, to really put us on the leading edge of keeping our homes and our neighborhoods and our streets dry. And I do appreciate people's indulgence at this late hour. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Mayor and colleagues.
Any additional questions or comments from council members? If so, please raise your virtual hand. Vice Mayor Wood, seeing no one with their virtual hand raised, I'll turn the meeting back to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There's some great comments, and I think as we go forward, talking about this bond referendum, that's something we certainly are going to need to to ramp up fairly quickly in order to get these projects identified and get the information out to the public. And I think that's certainly something that we can tackle, at least in part, during our retreat on March 8th and 9th. Appreciate everybody's participation today. A little rocky because I'm not actually there and I didn't know I was going to take over, but I think everything went well, and I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.